take a few more comments. Phyllis, go ahead.
Well, as a child, and my first impression of God through the Golden Bible was definitely an old man with a beard. But as I grew and as I studied and as I learned, I feel God is a spirit. There's no form. Okay, so when I think of God, there's no longer an image.
Do other people have the same sense as Phyllis, God as formless, or more some of the other opinions that have been brought up about God as inevitably a male with a white beard, or not a white beard for Joanne because that's Santa Claus? Right. Risa.
Yeah, I would go with God as formless. And by the way, when you ask children to draw a picture of God, I've read that no matter what country, what religion, that little old man appears. So it seems to be a generic kind of, I guess old people represent wisdom and something. But to me, God is, if there is a God, which is still the question, is an amorphous, out there, all-encompassing.
Nice.
Something.
Ruth, you wanted to say something?
The first time I ever thought of God as being anything than a male is because of Joanne, because she was reading in temple a long, long time ago, and instead of saying he, she said she.
Oh my goodness.
It's a very long time ago, Joanne.
It is a long time ago, you're right.
And that was the first time I ever thought of God as anything else, as this man with the white beard. And now I try to think of him as just something out there, something that doesn't have a male or a female.
Wow.
It's interesting with some of the Sidurim and Machzorim, you'll have God language trying to be gender neutral rather than gender specific. I think for a while, the first instinct was to kind of compensate for all of the he male imagery, at male pronouns, to then use she. And perhaps that's what you heard Joanne do all those years ago. But another way to deal with it is to not have he or she, either to say it or to just repeat the word God, or if God is a stumbling block, use some other word. Something like that. I'm going to mute everybody only because there's some background noise and I'm not sure if you're all hearing it or I'm the only one who's hearing it. And if you want to speak, then of course you can unmute yourself. Elaine, go ahead.
Does it matter really what you think God might look like? Does it matter if it's a he or a she? Oh, shoot, hold on 1 minute.
It's always Elaine's background noise.
Forget
very
it.
popular.
It's a robot. What I wanted to say, I don't think it really matters how you picture God. I think the important thing is whether you believe that there is a something, a God of some sort, whether you have a belief in it or you don't believe. I mean, Christianity says the Son of God, which is obviously a male. I mean, the Son, has to be a male. But Judaism doesn't specify. And my feeling is that you could think of it as a princess or a gorgeous person up there in a gorgeous gown, or you could think of it as an old man like Santa Claus. But I don't think it matters how you picture God. I think what matters is your feeling that there is something, that there is a being up there, and you either believe that there is or you don't believe that there is.
Thanks for sharing that, Elaine. Alice, you wanted to say something else? I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, I think God is more, rather than a being or anything supernatural, I think God is a concept. And the concept that I think God is the old standby, the golden rule. And Betty Ann was talking about that, what you should do and you shouldn't do. I think God in everybody, if they really want to listen is present in their conscience. They know what they're supposed to do. Most people know what they're supposed to do if they really sit down and think about it and not put up any barriers to thinking about what should be and shouldn't be. And I think God, rather than a person, is just the concept of good over evil and how we can be better people. And I think it applies particularly to Judaism, because Judaism has always been very concerned with the outer world, with not just us, but tikkun olam is.
Thank you for sharing that, Alice. Risa?
Building on, in a way, what Alice said, there, but disagreeing. The concept of God, yes, is hopefully something innate in a lot of us in terms of goodness and making choices. The thing is that each religion, Judaism in particular, has its own view on what is the correct choice to make in certain situations. It's not, well, just because it's out, you put different people in different situations because of their background, you're going to come up with different answers, different decisions of what is just, different decisions of what is correct. The whole, not to get into the abortion issue, but the whole abortion issue. When is life? What is life? How do you, what the end of life? What can you do? These are difficult questions, and it isn't just a question of using your own judgment, yet there are guidelines that come along with it. And whether you want to call it God or you want to call it your religion based on God's word, but that it isn't just be good because it's good. You have to have an outline of what does that mean and how to make your choices.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to move on to just some comments in the chat that Myrna put when we were talking about the gender identity of God, or whether there should be a gender identity going, we moved into a direction of talking about formless God, but going back to the forms that either we create in our minds or that we've been taught or that we see in books or that we hear through pronouns. Myrna suggested, she put down Mother Nature as a gendered image of God that is feminine, and then the eternal as a gender sensitive or gender neutral term of God. So thank you, Myrna, for putting those in. I also wanted to point out in the chat before Myrna's comments, I just put in some images of God in the High Holidays Machzor and the Siddur for Shabbat and weekdays that were brought up in previous classes. And I put down Din, Rachamim, Melech, Avinu Malkeinu, Adonai, Elohim, Eloheinu. Forget the Yaakov part, I didn't cut and paste the whole thing there. So I wanted to start first with just reviewing, I'm going to put on the screen first I got to take this off the screen before I can put something else on the screen. All right, here we go. Okay, so this is it's not there yet. All right. Okay, are you seeing anything on the screen yet or not yet? No, okay, give me a second to go back to it. Okay, I'm going to put, okay, so this is a page from the Rosh Hashanah Machzor. It's actually the Silverman Machzor, one that we probably, I don't know if we ever used the Temple Beth Am, but many people grew up with this one. So this one, if you just looking on the English side alone, like the the two capital letter words that really pop out at you are Lord and King. And in Hebrew, this is the Hashem Melech, Hashem Malach, Hashem Yimloch Le'olam Va'ed. It's one of the piyutim, one of the poetry, and I see Risa kind of singing it in her head as the melody that she knows because she has led this on more than one occasion. And here, just an example of this alphabetic acrostic. So what you see in the High Holidays. So you have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, Kaf, Lamed. Did I do the next page? No, I didn't. I just did the first. But it goes all the way through Taf as a way of saying there's no way for us to describe God. So we're going to use lots of words. And Adire, Ayuma, is about God being mighty, and Biruei Barak, God being, well, here it's actually referring to angels who are created. So it's not all of the words pertain to God, but anytime you have a piyut that has an aleph through taf, it's getting you to think of either I want to thank you, God, and praise you, God, in all the ways I can from A to Z, or I'm going to describe you, God, in all the ways that I can from A to Z, acknowledging that there is no one word or one letter or one image that's going to capture you. That I wanted to show you that how for many people in the Machzor, what they don't like, I'd say, for many people, is the Lord King. And if you look at more recent Machzorim, including the one that we have, the Machzor Lev Shalem, the word king, instead of king, it says sovereign. Instead of Lord, it might say Adonai, just the Hebrew word, which seems a little softer than Lord. So that is one way of dealing with getting the male image out of your head. It doesn't always work, but for many it does. The other one I wanted to point out here is, and this also Risa has led from time to time, also in the morning service for Rosh Hashanah and also Yom Kippur, is Le'el Orech Din. The big word here that you see in the English side in capital letters is judgment. It's the Yom Hadin, is the day of judgment. God is the God of judgment. And I bring this up in particular because I think there's two, I wouldn't say competing, but more maybe complementary images of God that come up on the high holidays themselves. And I put that in the chat. So in the chat, it's above Myrna's comment. I wrote in Hebrew letters and then a few up in English transliteration. I wrote Midat Hadin and Midat Harachamim. So has anyone ever heard of those terms and can apply them, maybe even if you can't apply them to the high holidays, but either the word din or rachamim or midat hadin, midat harachamim. Risa, go ahead, Nisha, on you.
Midat hadin, midat harachamim, the attribute of judgment and the attribute of mercy.
Right. Okay. So you know, yes. So go ahead. Before you continue, I wanted to point out the word midat is the same word as midat, like we have parasha and parashat. So midat, whenever it's followed by some kind of noun, it's midat instead of midah. You might have heard of midot, midos. There are some Orthodox communities where they have classes for women called midos classes. Classes of attributes to teach you how to be a good person. Not that men don't need it as well. I just have happened to see more midos classes for women than for men. So a midah is an attribute. And when we talk about midot, we're talking about our own personal attributes and character. So if we're talking about trying to become better people, character development, moral development, we are trying to achieve or do better in certain attributes, certain areas. But also when we talk about midot, we're talking about God's attributes. And in fact, many Jewish values, and we talk about striving for good midot in ourselves as human beings, what we essentially are trying to do is emulate midot of God, the certain midot of God. And the midot of God that come across very strongly in High Holidays liturgy are what Risa just translated, midat hadin and midat harachamim. So Risa, say a little bit more about the din part and the rachamim part.
Well, the din part is judgment and judging us. We're judged on the high holidays for our actions in the past year, you know, for good or for bad, but we are being judged. How did we behave and how did we hold up? And then we're hoping for God to use God's attributes of mercy and to judge us with kav zchut, to the gently, with
benefit of the doubt.
Thank you. Yeah.
Right. So midat hadin comes across very strongly in that piyut that I put up there on the screen before. That was le'el orech din, God who is an arranger of justice, or who is a lawgiver and who metes out judgment. That's midat hadin. Midat harachamim, you may be familiar when you hear the word rachamim. What are some English words that come to mind, or maybe some Yiddish words that come to mind?
Rahmanis, you have rahmanis on someone, you have pity or feeling for someone.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so pity, compassion, all of those words, when we do the 13 attributes of God that are repeated many times on the high holidays, more so even on Yom Kippur than on Rosh Hashanah, it's Hashem, Hashem, El Rachum, Mechanun, Erech Apayim, V'Rav Chesed. All of that stuff, they're all synonyms for God giving us the benefit of the doubt, God showing Rahmanas on us. And what I put up there in the chat also, right after I wrote in the transliteration, Midat Hadin and Midat HaRachamim, I put in names of God that in rabbinic literature are associated with each of those different attributes of God. So it's not a black and white thing, but in rabbinic texts, oftentimes there is the understanding that when we see the name Elohim in the Torah or anywhere in the Tanakh, or we see Eloheinu or Elohei or Elohai, any of those words are somehow conjure up or connected with Midat Hadin, the attribute of judgment. Whereas the name Hashem, Adonai, though when we see that name in the Torah, that it is associated more with God's Midat HaRachamim, God's attribute of mercy and compassion. And some of this you will not hear in an Orthodox context, but in non-Orthodox context and also in just biblical scholarship entities that are not religious at all, they often will talk about source criticism and different parts of the Torah perhaps being attributed to different sources. And the two of the sources that are listed in some of these, put this down, there's the E and J. So you may have heard these. So like the E parts of the Torah are the ones are the Elohistic parts of the Torah that have God's Elohim name in it. And then the J parts of the J parts of the Torah refer to where God's name is Elohim. And why a J? Because J and Y are interchangeable often. You know, like the Hebrew name Judah, the Hebrew name Yehuda is Judah in English, or Judith, Yehudit, Yehudim, Jews. So that's why the J. You may have seen this term, probably not so much in Jewish context, but if you've seen some English Bible translations, you might see Jahweh or Yahweh, and that's where the J part comes from. So regardless if this is something interesting to you or you believe it, you don't believe it, but that's where these terms come from. But in the more traditional context, the E and J, the Elohim and the Adonai, refer to Midat Hadin and Midat HaRachamim. The most, probably the most prominent place you will see it in the Torah, where there's an abrupt shift from Elohim to Hashem, is in the story of creation. In Genesis chapter 1, you've got Elohim all over the place. Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or. God said, let there be light. And throughout chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, we then get a couple of times with Hashem Elohim, God, the Lord name and the Elohim name, the Midah of Din and the Midah of Rachamim mixed. And there's some really nice midrashim that say how God originally wanted to create the world with just Midat Hadin, just with this strict attribute of judgment and the black and white world. And then God realized that the world could not sustain itself by being just a place of judgment and with believing in a God who's just a God who metes out justice, that we needed to have compassion as well. But God thought, I can't just make the world just a world of compassion, because if it's only compassion, then we'd never punish people who maybe are deserving of punishment, or there'd never be any negative motivations to avoid doing certain bad things. So we need both compassion and judgment in order for this world to be sustained, the Elohim part of God and the Hashem part of God. So if you do look closely at Genesis 1 and 2, you'll see that abrupt shift. Okay, so I want to move on to something else. I want to move on to some of the familiar prayers that we have that are not just part of high holidays. Where do I want to start? No, I want to start with the Amida and then I'll go to Shema. I know I'm making everybody nauseous right now, but actually, no, I'll just leave the Shema on and I'll talk about the Amida, because we did the Amida a little bit last time. So in the Amida, in the very first bracha of the Amida, we refer to God as Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Velohei Yaakov. And so Elohei is one of those Elohim words. So possibly we could be dealing there with God's Midat Hadin. But I think there's a little bit more that we see in the Amidah. The very fact that the Torah says Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, rather than just saying Eloheinu. or rather than just saying Elohei, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and putting the names of the three patriarchs in order. From there, we get this idea that you have to have your own personal experience of God, that Abraham had his own personal experience of God, Yitzchak had his own personal experience of God, Yaakov has his own personal experience of God. So when we're davening the Amidah, when we say those words, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, or if we add the Imahot and say Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, that we're not just reminding God, hey, God, I'm related to those really good people that you made promises to, but it's also a sense of, I want my name to be the next link in the chain. Just how you were there for Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, just how you had personal relationships with them, I want to strive to have my own personal relationship with you. And yes, we can and should learn from those who came before us, our biblical ancestors, but we also have to learn for ourselves. And part of that learning for ourselves may mean conjuring up different images or focusing on different images of God. And as was mentioned earlier in the conversation and your excellent comments that you made before, it may be an issue of God who has form or who doesn't have form, God who is gender neutral or male or female, or none of the above, all of the above, God who is formless, God who has a form, God who in your mind means something, or as Alice mentioned, God who is not really even a form or formless, but God is not a thing. God is more the concepts that are underlying what we do. So I now want to share on the screen and move our discussion to a very familiar prayer, which is the Shema. So let me find it. Okay, so this is from Siddur Sim Shalom. Okay, and the Shema is that when I say the Shema, I'm referring to this one line, this Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Adonai our God, Adonai alone, or Adonai is one. But it's also this whole package, this whole, these biblical texts, Ve'ahavta and Ve'haya'im Shamoa, from the books of Deuteronomy Chapter 6 and Deuteronomy Chapter 11, and then the next part of the Shema, Bamidbar, book of Numbers, chapter 15. And even there's a sandwich around the Shema. There's blessings before and blessings afterwards. And all of that is considered the Shema. Before we look at that whole package, that whole sandwich, and not just the one line, let us focus on the one line. That one line is really considered to be the central statement of Judaism. It is traditional Jews recite this phrase 3 times a day, part of the morning service, Shacharit, part of the evening service, Mariv, not part of Mincha, incidentally, but at bedtime, the Kriyat Shema al Hamitah. That was the first prayer that many people teach their children. It's also the Shema phrase, which is from Deuteronomy 6, is also recited as part of the final step of the conversion process to Judaism. Whether it's right before going into the mikvah, usually right after going to the mikvah, or in some ceremony following the mikvah immersion. And also throughout Jewish history, Jews have died with the words of the Shema on their lips. And as you know, the Shema is also printed on the tiny scroll, the cloth that fits inside the mezuzah that you find on the doorposts of Jewish homes. It's a very familiar phrase, but what does the Shema come to teach us about God? So raise your hand if you want to say something, or just unmute yourself. Just in that one line, what comes across? Phyllis, go ahead.
Well, comes across that there's only one God.
Right, so one, meaning
Yes,
not
one.
2 or 3 or
Exactly.
multiple, okay. Any other concepts that come forth, Ruth?
My mother told me that it means that God is everywhere, and that it was the first prayer that I learned. And it's the prayer she told me to use since we grew up in a Christian neighborhood. Whenever there was a prayer service, that's what she taught me to say. And she said it just means that God is everywhere and with you all the time.
Yeah, fair. Very nice. Elaine, did you want to add to that?
2 things. I remember, I think it was in Schindler's List, when you saw one of the older men going to the steps to go down to meet his fate, that he recited the Shema, like that was the last thing he said before, he was going, apparently he knew to his death or thought he was going. But I think that the Shema shows us that there is a God, that you have to believe in a God. Getting back to something that we discussed earlier, I think it might have been Alice who said something about ethics, that, we live by ethics. I don't know what religion it is, maybe it's Unitarian or whatever, but that's what they go by, that you have to live a good life. You can't just, everyone has to do the right thing and be good to the neighbor, et cetera, et cetera. But there's no belief in a being or something that rules us or that we should believe in.
Okay, thanks for that, Elaine. Risa, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I also think it encompasses the idea that bad things come from God too. If we don't have the dichotomy of a devil as opposed to God, Adonai Echad is that he is one, and all the powers that there are, whether they be for good or be for ill, emanate from God. And it's a hard thing to kind of wrap yourself around when we want God to be good and merciful and kind in his judgment. But evil and bad is part of encompassed in God too. God is one. All the power is with God.
Excellent point. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the Broadway show. It wasn't on Broadway for very long. It was by Stephen Schwartz. It was called Children of Eden. And in Children of Eden, God is the main character, and God is not off stage. God is actually very present. And I think I told you that Adi years ago was in a community theater version of this, and they asked him to play God. And it was right at the time where I was pregnant with Rivka. And he originally wanted to turn down the part because he thought, my wife is, if she goes into labor, I can't be going to rehearsals, right? So like, maybe this is not the best part. And I never forget, the director of the play said to him, well, God, the part that you're playing, that I want you to play, is not a part that interacts with the other characters very much. So you don't have to come to any of the rehearsals. You could just show up. So since the play isn't really starting till middle of February and your baby's not due till beginning of February, all right, so you might miss rehearsals, but you're not going to miss the actual play. And so Rivka was born before the play. And the costume that Adi had as God, because even if we think of God as formless, for the purposes of this play, God had to have a form. And not only was he male, just by virtue of Adi being male, but also the costume, that it started out with, it starts out with God being white, like a white sequin robe. It was all beautiful. And then once the Garden of Eden scene happened, it turns a little more dark. And then by the time of the flood of Noah, God is wearing a red sequin garb that's very reminiscent of what people say the devil looks like. I think that really goes towards Risa's point of God being echad means God is the same person. God may wear different clothes at different times or appear in different ways that appear to be in different clothes, but it's still the same God. And that may be comforting, but it's also a little frightening. Alice, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether that was the first instance of monotheism.
Of Shema, the Shema being the first instance of monotheism?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, the way tradition, how it comes down to us, even before the book of Deuteronomy, when we have the book of Bereshit and you have Avram following the call of God, he's called by God, he goes to Canaan, and many of the midrashim that describe why Avram was chosen by God is that he was the first monotheist. So there may not have been a statement of faith, but there was definitely this idea that it was something new. And although Abraham, we can't necessarily say he was the first Jew because many people came from him, not just Jews, but he was probably the first monotheist. And then in terms of a statement of monotheism, this is the first that we see in some kind of credo type of way, like a statement of faith. And I work with students who are converting to Judaism, and they ask me, what do I have to believe in? Like, is there a catechism? And this is the closest thing we have to a catechism. It's this belief system. Okay, so I want to just say a couple more things about the Shema. I know a few other of you had comments. You could hold off on them because I'm still staying with the Shema for a little bit. So some of you mentioned, so Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu Hashem Echad means that God is one, as in all aspects, good, bad, everything emanates from God. The fact that God is one, not two or three. God, here you may see in the translation here, it says, Hear, O Israel, Adonai our God, Adonai alone. Alone is another way of translating instead of one. So alone can be as in only. God is only, God is unique, God cannot be compared. Alone may sound even like lonely, that God is, there isn't anybody helping God there, even though we talk about angels and we have prophets, there's still in Judaism a very strong sense of God is alone and that God is the power that orders and that unifies all of creation. And going back to Ruth's point, if that's the case, then everything in the world is one as well, and that God is everywhere. So I do want to look at the words of the Shema even more closely. The word Shema itself, whether we translate it as hear or listen, I think it's very important, that word, because what it's saying to us is that we have to seek to hear, to listen, to understand God, that's part of the Jewish mission, is to try lishmoa, that it's not necessarily that we do hear it, but that we're striving to hear it, that we're striving to listen, to hear this. That's my mom calling. Let me tell her I can't talk right now. Sorry, Mom. Okay. So that's the word Shema. The word Yisrael, Israel refers both to the person whose name was Israel, Yaakov, Jacob, whose name changed to Israel after the wrestling match with the divine being. But it also refers to the people of Israel, the community of Israel, Bnei Israel. And spirituality in Judaism, it has a communal aspect as well as an individual aspect. It doesn't just say, this credo doesn't start with Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Adonai is God, Adonai alone. It's Hear, O Israel, that this is a statement that includes a people. Adonai Eloheinu, this phrase, Adonai is our God, that exhibits a balance between the attributes of din and rachamim, of judgment and mercy. And then the echad is really what most of you spoke about when you made comments about this phrase. You focused on the echad, God's oneness, God's onlyness, God's uniqueness, but perhaps God's loneliness too. I think it was Josh Feldstein in one of our previous classes who brought up Joshua Heschel's book, God in Search of Man. And the title of that book indicates or implies that it's not just people who are seeking God, but that God is seeking to be in relationship with us as well. So all of these combine and may kind of give us this concept of why this is Judaism's central statement of faith. Now, I did say that Shema is a bigger thing than just that one line. So let's look at some of these other sections, some of which also you're familiar with. But before I move from the Shema, one thing I did want to show you, I'm not sure if it's going to show with my virtual background. So let me get rid of my virtual background for a moment, and you'll know that I'm actually in Rivka's room and not in my office here. So let me do that. Let me change. And let's hope it's not too messy back there. And if not, we're among friends, right? And if it is messy, we know it's not Rivka's fault because she's not home. All right. So what I wanted to show you is in the tefillin. This is one of the 4 texts that are in the tefillin, and it has this, and this is how it appears in the Torah. So if you see Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Echad, there are 2 letters that pop up much bigger. And when you're reading in this, the Parsha is Parshat Va'etchanan, this is how it appears in the Torah. So can anyone see what those 2 letters are? Anyone want to say what they are? Risa, can you see what they are?
Yeah, ayin and daled, ed.
Right, ayin and daled together, those 2 letters spell the word ed. And ed means witness. You might see on the bottom of a ketubah, those of you who have decorative ketubahs in your houses, the bottom where the witnesses sign, each line sometimes says right before it ed, or ne'um ed, signature of the witness. So when we're saying the Shema, we are bearing witness. We're bearing witness to God's existence. We're bearing witness to God's unity, God's oneness. And how are we doing this? We're doing this by loving God. So I'm going to go back to the Ve'ahavta, because the loving God is the theme that comes across very strongly in this
First word.
right? With someone, right, the very first word. So Ve'ahavta, what are some other words that have that root in addition to Ve'ahavta? So there aren't any in there, but the word ahava, last time you were in a mall, probably was at least a year ago, but the mall ladies that run after you, usually Israeli mall ladies, and they're selling this. I am so popular today. Let me just say that I'm on a call. First my mom, now my children, which is all good, that I'll talk to them afterwards. Give me a second. Okay, go back to this. All right, so would someone like to read the Ve'ahavta? So I was talking about the mall ladies, yeah. So the Ahava Dead Sea, the Dead Sea creams, the name of the brand is Ahava, because love. It's always nice to buy a product that's called love. So Ahava. So would someone like to read the English of Ve'ahavta right here? The you shall love Adonai your God. Elaine, would you like to read it?
If you can enlarge it a little bit.
There we go. Is that a little better?
Yes, you shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words which I command you this day, you shall take to heart. Teach them diligently to your children, and recite them at home and away night and day. Bind them as a sign upon your hand, and as a reminder above your eyes. Inscribe them upon the doorposts of your homes and upon your gates.
Okay, so this whole section, the Ve'ahavta, combined with the Shema, because it actually appears both all of these texts, except for the silent part, the praise be God's glorious sovereignty throughout all time, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. That part's not in the Torah. But if you look in Deuteronomy chapter 6, you'll see it'll go straight from Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad to Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. So they're meant to be read as a unit. So essentially what this is teaching us, that we bear witness to God's existence. And how do we do that? By loving God. And how do we love God? By taking on, it's called Ol Malchut Shamayim. We take on the yoke, the responsibility of God's sovereignty, that in and of itself is an important part of being Jewish. But that's not all. The second very important part about being Jewish is V'haya'im Shamoa, the Devarim, Yud Aleph, from also the book of Deuteronomy, but a later Parshat Ekev, Deuteronomy chapter 11. And would someone like to read this? The English, I'll make this bigger as well. Barbara, will you read it for us? First unmute.
Wait, do I say? Okay. If you will earnestly heed the mitzvot I give you this day, to love Adonai your God and to serve God with all your heart and all your soul, then I will favor your land with rain at the proper season, in autumn and in spring, and you will have an ample harvest of grain and wine and oil. I will assure abundance in the fields of your cattle. You will eat to contentment. Take care lest you be tempted to stray and to worship false gods. For then Adonai's wrath will be directed against you. God will close the heavens and hold back the rain. The earth will not yield its produce. You will soon disappear from the good land which Adonai is giving you. Sign upon your hand and let them be a reminder above your eyes. Teach them to your children, repeat them at home and away, night and day. Inscribe them upon the doorposts of your homes and upon your gates. Then your days and the days of your children on the land that Adonai swore to give you to give to your ancestors will endure as the days of the heavens over the earth.
Okay, so we have some repetition here, right? In this chapter, this section of the book of Deuteronomy, there's some similarity to what we see in Deuteronomy 6, specifically with reference to the mezuzah and tefillin. But the focus in Deuteronomy 11 is more on the mitzvot, the mitzvah system. Do the mitzvot, good things will happen to you. Don't do the mitzvot, bad things will happen to you. And we know this is not a description of reality. It's more of a halavai, if only things were like this. But it's very much focused on the mitzvah system, which is what I'm going to do in the last part of class. But first, let's take a few more comments, and then I'm going to show you what I referred to before as the sandwich around the Shema. Okay, go ahead, Joanne.
I have a different machzor. It's called Matzor et Ratzon. It was put together by a guy who's not a rabbi. It's a long story, but anyway.
I have it. You actually recommended it to me, and when we were looking for a new machzor, I actually spoke to the man who put it together, and I had a copy of it. We looked at, was one of the two we were looking at. Anyway, go ahead.
He's an interesting man, but anyway, the way he translated it is interesting. It's listen, Israel, Adonai, our God, Adonai is one. Blessed is the essence of God's glorious majesty forever and ever. Love Adonai, your God, with all your heart, with all your being, with all your power. Fix these words which I command you today in your mind and your heart. The rest of it's basically the same, but I love that. Blessed is the essence of God's glorious majesty. And then the beginning of the second paragraph is, if you pay close attention to my commandments that I'm teaching you today, then I will provide rain for your land. It's an if-then construction.
Right, but it's interesting, the Hebrew that goes along with that pay attention is tishme'u, which is the same as Shema. So when we think Shema, sometimes it's translated hear, which sounds like a physical ability that you either have or you don't have, or you have less of at certain points of your life and more of in other times of your life. But it's not just a matter of hearing, it's about listening, focusing, paying attention. I think that translation captures that a little bit, more. Lovely. Elaine, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think this is the part that most people, or some people, including myself, have the most trouble with. If you don't do these mitzvot, you're going to be punished. If you do them, you're going to be given all the goods and have a good life and no troubles, etc. I think that's what's troublesome about this portion. Having gone through, tragedy as other people have, did it happen to me? Was I punished because I didn't do all the mitzvot? Do other people, do the Jews who went through the Holocaust, did they go through the Holocaust because they were bad people? So this is a little bit troublesome. You either do what I say or you're going to be in trouble. If you do what I say, you're going to have a wonderful life. Everything is going to be good. Your fields will be full of produce or whatever. If you don't, you're doomed.
Right. So what Elaine just described is the problem of theodicy. And Joanne typed in the chat, that's Job, right? Job is an example of someone who's a good person and bad things happen to him. So the problem of theodicy has two sides to it. It's the Job side, when bad things happen to good people, but there's also good things happening to bad people. During the years where the Nazis were in power, there was a period of time where it really did look like these really evil people were being rewarded somehow. They were the ones who were wealthy and who had power, and that's beyond unfair is not a strong enough word to talk about it, and to say even that it's a little bit problematic. It's more than problematic. It's something very troublesome, deeply troublesome. Ruth, you wanted to say something? Need to unmute.
There's a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People.
Harold Kushner.
Yes, and Rabbi Kushner came to Beth Am and spoke. He was a guest speaker, and I read that book before he came. As someone who had something bad happen to them, having a handicapped child, it was very comforting to think that God doesn't punish us. What he does is he gives us the ability to carry on our lives. Things happen to us that have nothing to do with God. He got everything started.
Right.
And
Right. And Rabbi Kushner, what Rabbi Kushner does very interestingly in his book, and incidentally, the book is not why bad things happen to good people, but when bad things
Yeah.
happen to good people, what do you do? And what is God's role in that? Rabbi Kushner goes through the book of Job and says there's three ways we can read the book of Job, and they're all problematic, right? So one is, well, yes, Job was a good person, but he got punished anyway. So then what does that tell us? Well, maybe God is not good. Maybe it's that bad part of God that Risa was alluding to earlier, that God is one, God is everything, both the good and the bad. But Rabbi Kushner rejects that premise. He said, no, Job was a good guy. But he said the only way you can make sense of the book of Job is either by saying, no, really, Job was a bad guy, or God is bad, or that God is not all powerful. And so what Rabbi Kushner ends up concluding is that God is not all powerful, which in and of itself is problematic for other reasons, but he deals very well with the issue of course God is good, and of course Job was good, and God would not cause bad things to happen. So it must be that God did not have the power to do anything, that really God's role in the world is not to punish and to reward in the way Deuteronomy 6 tells us that is an image of God, but it's more that God is the being who is there for us after the bad things happen, and also when the good things happen, but specifically when bad things happen, instead of blaming God as God causing that bad thing, that God is the one to whom we turn for guidance, for support, for resilience in bad times. So there are many people who really think that theology resonates, and for him specifically, because he had a handicapped child who died at a very young age. Yes.
Rabbi, there was the book I gave you also that Lowell's Rabbi wrote.
Yes, by Rabbi Leader. Yes, it has a lot of that in that as well. A lot of
Same
Rabbi
kind of
Kushner.
thing. And he more or less, his focus, I believe, if I remember correctly, is how to deal with these things.
Right.
When
Right.
bad things happen.
So I think, the way I read the V'haya paragraph, the Deuteronomy 11, and also many Psalms and other places in our tradition that convey this idea, I view it as halavai. I don't view it as a description of the way the world is, but more of an ideal of the way we'd like the world to be and strive for the world to be. And it's one of many ways to deal with the problematic text in the Torah. Barbara Levine, Mark Levine, I think one of you were, Mark is raising his hand. Go ahead.
Yes, my personal feeling about being good and being bad is its own punishment or reward. By that I mean, if you're a bad person, if you're evil, if you're rotten and you do nasty things, you are unable to enjoy all the good things that you've been given, whether it's family or friends or the sunrise or however you want to define it. On the other hand, if you're a good person, then you can fully enjoy, and your reward is that you can enjoy all the things that you have been given. And so it's not really up to God, it's how you conducted yourself, and you actually give yourself the reward or the punishment.
Nice comment, Mark. I'm going to move us because of time to something else so I wanted you to at least have this visual in front of you of the structure of the Shema rather than the words of the Shema. So it's 2 pages, and I can't show the whole thing at once. It's this page and then this page. It's the Shema and her brachot, Shema u'birchoteha. And the way the Shema package works is if you have a minyan in person, there's the Baruch Hu. And what is the function of the Baruch Hu? Well, the Baruch Hu is not part of the Shema and her brachot, but rather it's the call to worship. It stands just outside like a carnival barker, encouraging people to enter. So that's what the Baruch Hu does. In terms of the text themselves that you say, whether you're davening alone or not in a minyan, or with a minyan, is there are 2 brachot before the Shema, and then there are, depending whether it's daytime or evening Shema, there is an after bracha, 3rd bracha, or a 3rd and 4th bracha. So in the morning, some of you were at morning minyan just this morning. So there's the Yotzer Or blessing, and right afterwards is Ahava Rabbah. Ahava, there's that love word again. So Yotzer Or, that conveys the image of God as creator. Ahava Rabbah, that conveys the image of God loves us so much that God gave us a gift, an everlasting gift. And what is that? The gift of Torah. God gave Torah to the Jewish people as a prize gift. And you have similar themes at night, but at night, instead of saying God is Yotzer Or, we say God is Ma'ariv Aravim, that God is the one who causes evenings to happen, that distinguishes between night and day. And we have that bracha then leads into another bracha about love. Instead of it being ahava rabbah, it's ahavat olam, but it's very similar theme. God gave Torah to the Jewish people as a prize gift. So that's the first part of the Shema sandwich, the brachot before the Shema. Then there is the Shema itself. There is one God, and we should do God's mitzvot. And that Shema includes not only the one-liner, but also the sections from Deuteronomy and also the section from the book of Numbers that refers to tzitzit. Tzitzit are supposed to be a reminder of doing the mitzvot. Okay. And then after the Shema, as I said, depending whether it's morning or evening, you're going to have brachot after a bracha or brachot afterwards. In the morning, the bracha that we say after the Shema is called the Geula blessing. It ends with the word Ga'al Yisrael, and the theme is God has saved the Jewish people at important moments. So when we use the word redemption in Judaism, we generally are referring to or often are referring to, and certainly on Passover, we're referring to the redemption of Bnei Israel from slavery in Egypt. And we also use the word redemption to talk about a future redemption in the days of the Mashiach. But so here, Birkat Geula in the morning, and then in the evening, we also have a Birkat Geula. And these funky looking people here in the diagrams here. So who's with the tambourine and who's walking on water over there? Anyone want to guess? Risa.
Moses and
Miriam
Miriam.
is drowning in the water or walking through the water with
Yeah.
barely surviving. And Moshe, I would imagine, is walking through on water or through the water, whatever.
Right. So we're not really sure. I mean, you see here, I mean, it makes sense. It's Miriam, because Miriam is often talked about and described with her timbrels in her hand, that she and the women had the foresight to bring musical instruments with them when they left Egypt and they had to pack in a hurry. What did they remember to bring? Instruments, because they knew God was going to save them and they wanted to be able to rejoice with song. And the rejoicing with song, Shirat Hayam, includes the words, Mi chamocha bailim Adonai, Mi kamocha nedzar b'kodesh. Some of you have heard me share the midrash where God doesn't immediately split the sea, that initially God wants there to be some demonstration of faith. So walk in the water, and only when the water is coming up to your nose, and you can no longer say mi chamocha, you can only say mi kamocha because the water is covering your throat, then God parts the sea. So who are the people who did this? According to one midrash, the people were fighting over who should go first, and someone from the tribe of Yehuda was the one who came first. So this could be Nachshon ben Aminadav, or it could be Moshe. After Nachshon went in, or maybe Miriam as well, she took the leap of faith and had the timbrel up, that only after that did God part the sea. And Moshe, since Moshe was the leader, then this most likely was Moshe. So that, whichever image you want to use there, both of those images are ones we're supposed to be thinking of. And the reason why we drop our voice at the end of the morning Amida, not the Amida, the morning blessing, the Geula blessing, is because we're supposed to be keeping this image, whether it's the image of Miriam with the timbrel or Moshe or Nachshon having the leap of faith and crossing the sea. This idea of God redeeming us is something that we're supposed to carry into the Amidah with us. And that's why in the morning, you wouldn't, traditionally, you wouldn't make an interruption after the Ga'al Yisrael, you go right into the Amidah. At night, you can, because there's already an interruption by the addition of a second bracha, right? So the second blessing at night is Hashkivenu, and it's specifically focused on the theme of wanting God to protect us, especially at night. That night is a scary time, and sleeping could be viewed as a mini death. What if you don't wake up in the morning? And so that comes into our evening services. So that's the overall Shema package here. This from the Baruch Hu, the two brachot before the Shema itself, meaning the one-liner, and the 3 biblical passages, 2 from Deuteronomy, 1 from Numbers, and then the bracha or brachot afterwards, depending on whether it's day or night. So I wanted to show you that, but I also wanted to show something else to you. I don't know if Joanne is still on the call. Let me see. Is
No, she's
Joanne?
here.
She's here. Oh, because you had a package for her. Okay, so the book that you recommended, that 8 Ratzon, I included in here that I want to show you. It's in the 8 Ratzon Sidur, page 50. So I'm not sure if it's in the Machzor on that same page, but it's a meditation that is to remind ourselves of what is affirmed in the Shema. And it acknowledges the fact that there are many different images of God. So according to this 8 Ratzon Sidur, there's an intro that says, we now turn to the stage of recognizing that all of the many images of God are one, and recognizing the personal God in the transcendent God. So yes, in some images of God, God is Midat Hadin, the God of judgment. And in others, God is Midat Harachamim, the God of mercy. Some may have male images of God, some may have female images of God, Mother Nature, Shekhinah, etc. Or some may have gender neutral images of God. A God that has a form, a God that's formless. The God who is transcendent, meaning up there, very powerful and distant from us. And the God who is immanent, the God who is close by, who's very personal. And Shema is very much, especially if we use the translation that Joanne shared with us about the essence of God's sovereignty, the essence of God's oneness, that the Shema is very much about understanding the unity within diversity. And so I'm going to share the screen here with this meditation before the Shema. And we'll have that for us in a moment. Here we go. Okay, so when I put it on the scanner, it's a little cockeyed, but I hope you can still read it. Okay, so I'm going to read it. You're welcome to read with me with the sound off, just so that we're not out of sync, so we can be in sync with each other while we're singing it. And then I'll pause when there's any kind of instructions here that are in italics. Okay, all right. And I'm not going to be able to close my eyes because I can't close my eyes and read at the same time, but you can close your eyes. Okay, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and another. In the first bracha preceding the Shema, the Yotzer Or, we speak of God as creator of the universe, the one who set the world into motion, and the one who sets it into motion each and every day. Let's breathe in and breathe out. In the second bracha preceding the Shema, Ahava Rabbah, or Ahavat Olam, we speak of God's love for us, collectively and individually, and of the great gift that God has given us, a Torah of life, a sustaining heritage, a pathway to wisdom. Breathe in and out again a few times. God is our creator, the one who made everything. And God is our lover, the one who loves each one of us. God is transcendent, beyond the stars, beyond the imagination. And God is immanent, present at each moment within our own hearts and minds. Breathe in and breathe out a few times. God is impersonal and distant, moving the stars. And God is nearby and available, moving our hearts. And those are the same. The creator of the world loves each of us, cares for each of us. The one who loves us created the world and creates it anew each day. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. We have many other images of God: a sheltering presence, a guiding shepherd, a loving parent, a bountiful monarch, a demanding judge, a compassionate forgiver, a loyal partner. And after the Shema, we focus on God as the source of salvation, as the source of redemption. In Gaal Yisrael, Birkahat Geula, we affirm that all of these images of God are one. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. We affirm that all of these images of God are one, that your oneness embraces all of our envisionings, all of our understandings. We affirm that you are available to us in all of these ways, that we can call on you using each of these images that we can experience: your tenderness and your majesty, your grandeur and your love. Listen, listen, Israel. Listen, everyone. Listen, Joe. Listen, Barbara. Listen, Ruth. Listen, Risa. Listen, Alice. Listen, Myrna. Listen, Elaine. Listen, Shelley. Listen, Susie. Listen, Betty Ann. Listen, Joanne. Listen, Phyllis. Listen, Marilyn. Listen, Ira. Listen, Mark. Listen, Barbara. Adonai is our God. Adonai is one. Shema Yisrael. Adonai Eloheinu. Adonai Echad. And I'm going to ask everyone to unmute, and we will say the Shema. It's not going to sound in unity, but we're going to strive for the unity within the diversity, the unity within the cacophony. Okay. Shema Yisrael, Okay, some reactions to that reading and this idea of God being a unity, but yet also encompassing the diversity of God and the diversity of the people who pray to God. Susie.
Well, like I started to write in the chat, God has many different traits. Shekhinah is usually the loving motherly trait, and then there's the mean disciplinarian, and then there's a God that forgives, and all those things that you listed are all aspects of a God, like they're all aspects of people.
Yes.
And God, like people, goes through different, you could call emotions. Sorry. So God encompasses everything that we feel in those ways, and anything that we could feel, God can feel. And it's like we're part of each other.
Very nice. And I think when you first put the comment in the chat, Susie, it was when we were having the discussion about the male versus female images of God, and you associated the motherly traits and with the Shekhinah, and the more masculine traits with the name Adonai. Very nice. Anyone else have any reflections on this? Let me see if I see any. Elaine, did you want to say something?
Well, I didn't have my hand raised, but I keep thinking that it's just the belief that there is someone or something that, that's the basis of Judaism.
Right. And that it doesn't matter necessarily what that it is, what that image is, just that there be something.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to conclude with just kind of a little forspice of what's to come. Barbara and Mark, is your hand still up, or that's from before? It's from before. Okay, so let's lower the hand. All right, that's okay. Got it. Okay, so I'm going to show on the screen, this is just one of the very many ways to think about mitzvot. That second and third biblical passages in the Shema, separate from the issue of reward and punishment, just the very idea of doing mitzvot is a very Jewish concept. The mitzvah is the building block of Jewish spirituality. And there are many different definitions of these different types of mitzvot. There are different categorization schemes that explain why we do the mitzvot, or that enable us to take the mitzvot and put them into different categories. I know when I used to do an in-person class with bar mitzvah students and their families called a scavenger hunt for God. And one of the steps in that scavenger hunt for God was we had to talk about different examples of mitzvot and how did the different mitzvot connect us to God. And usually when you ask people to give an example of a mitzvah, particularly young kids, almost every example of mitzvah is a community service mitzvah, which are mitzvot. Like clearly visiting the sick is a mitzvah, giving tzedakah, giving food or housing or both to the homeless. All of these are acts of social justice, acts of gemilut chasadim. Those are all mitzvot, but they're only part of the mitzvah system. So a way to expand thinking about the mitzvah system is to have these categories. So I'm going to ask you to give me some examples here. So let's start out with, since I use that as an example, number 2, mitzvot ben adam l'chavero and mitzvot ben adam l'makom. They're usually listed like this: mitzvot ben adam l'chavero and mitzvot ben adam l'makom. Makom is one of the names of God as place, using Ruth's mother's conception of God being everywhere. Right? Mitzvot ben adam l'chavero, the interpersonal mitzvot, the ethical mitzvot. So ethical are very tied into the interpersonal. The mitzvot ben adam l'makom are more like the God-related ritual mitzvot. So if you can give me some examples of mitzvot ben adam l'chavero, interpersonal, ethical mitzvot. Just raise your hand if you want to shout one out.
You should be good to your fellow man, and Yom Kippur, if you injured person, you apologize to them and correct it with them.
Right. It's not enough to just ask for forgiveness from God. You need to ask for forgiveness from individual people who you feel you have hurt.
Right.
Okay. Give me one more example, somebody else, of a mitzvah ben adam l'chavero, an interpersonal, ethical mitzvah. Elaine?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Yep, that's as mitzvah ben adam l'chavero as you can get, right? Okay, let's go to this other categorization scheme, a way to think about the mitzvot. There are the do's and the don'ts. They're sometimes referred to as positive mitzvot and negative mitzvot, the aseh and the lo ta'aseh. So what would be an example of an aseh, a positive, a do this, and what would be an example of a lo ta'aseh, negative? So,
honor thy father and mother.
Okay, so Marilyn just said, honor your father and your mother. That's a do. Okay, Risa, do you want to add one, either a do or a don't?
Yeah, eat kosher, don't eat a pig, and don't eat a pig. Don't eat the other animals listed.
Right, so you have, within the kashrut system, you have do's and don'ts. Exactly.
Don't cheat on the scales of justice for your weighing out their money and in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Observe the Sabbath.
And within the Shabbat, there's even 2 ways that I forget which class this was. I think it was the Torah, the weekly Torah class, the Torah. Right, in the book in Parshat Yitro, which we read a few earlier this month, last month. It was the first set, the 10 Commandments, where the Shabbos mitzvah is described as Zachor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, which is often understood remember Sabbath day, and the positive aspects of Shabbat in the sense of make kiddush, have this special meal where you have these special prayers, do these particular prayers at home or in shul. And then there's in the book of Deuteronomy, when we have the 10 commandments, the fourth commandment is listed as Shamor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kadisho, that you should observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And this is the rabbinic understanding is that this is a focus more on the don'ts of Shabbat, the things we refrain from doing on Shabbat. The 39 malachot system all fits into that. So the do's and the don'ts. All right, let's go to the third, home and synagogue. Another way to think about a mitzvah as one of the building blocks of Jewish life, of Jewish spirituality. Now, it's hard to say in synagogue because so many of us have not been in synagogue for so long, but let's call this synagogue, let's call Zoom synagogue for now. But what are some of the mitzvot that are meant to be done at home and some that are more meant to be done in synagogue?
Attend the synagogue so people will have a minyan in which to say Kaddish or other prayers.
Okay, and Risa?
Kashrut again in the home, but also Friday night ceremony at the table, the Seder, all those home rituals.
Yes. Anybody else want to give some home or synagogue examples of mitzvah?
Blessing the children.
Blessing the children. Joanne, go ahead.
Mezuzah.
Okay, so mezuzah, right? That's something that you can do at home, right? Sometimes you say, don't try this at home. This is one you try at home, right? And a mezuzah, actually, halachically, there are many who say you don't need a mezuzah at a shul, that the Torah scrolls themselves are enough, or that if you are going to have a mezuzah at the shul, you only need it on the front door. And Joanne, you may remember you and I picked out a mezuzah for the front door of the shul when we were in Israel many years ago.
Right.
And there actually had been one at the shul already, but it was on the inside door. We don't actually have a doorpost at Temple Beth Am. It's a little funky. So there's a mezuzah kind of in the inside and there's one on the outside, not really on the doorpost, but close. That's what you do. We have to work with the architecture you have, I guess. Okay, individual and community. This is a very touchy subject or a very relevant subject because of the corona pandemic, some things that we were not able to do in community before or that we've been doing in virtual community. But what are some mitzvot that are meant to be done in community? And what are ones that are meant or can be done as individuals? Marilyn.
Minyan.
Okay, so we mentioned minyan as community.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay, but I'm just tying what you said into what we said before. And any individual mitzvot that can be done as an individual. Ira?
I have a question regarding lighting Shabbos candles. Is that considered a mitzvah or is that not?
Okay, very good question. So when we talk about the 613 mitzvot, the 613 mitzvot are generally referring to the deoraita commandments, the mitzvot that are in the Torah or that can be derived from the Torah. Anything that's a mitzvah de rabbanan, a mitzvah that is rabbinic in nature, is not included in the 613, but is still a mitzvah. So for example, even our holidays, some of them are de rabbanan and some are deoraita. The holidays of Hanukkah and Purim, those are not deoraita mitzvot. Those are not part of the 613, but they are mitzvot. So Ira, in answer to your question about the lighting candles is a mitzvah. And if we go into all these categories here, it's a do. It's a mitzvah ben adam lamakom. It's something meant to be done at home. It can be done in synagogue, but it's meant to be done at home. It can be done and oftentimes is done by an individual. And it is very much a mitzvah. It's just over and above the 613. Okay,
Go ahead,
Ira.
The reason why I brought it is because it always seems like whenever, to bring Jewishness, so to speak, into the home, they always start with light the Shabbos candles. That's like the first thing you hear, that the woman should light the Shabbos candles. That seems to be the initial thing to try to do.
Right. Well, it's hard to say what the initial thing is. I mean, it's funny because different people have different takes on that. I think Chabad for sure. And when they started their home, even before there were mitzvah mobiles, when I was in the Catskills, I remember that Chabad would come to the bungalow colonies, and what would they bring? They'd bring Shabbos candles. I think it's what I would call, and with some organizational theorists and psychologists might call low-hanging fruit, right? It's something that's easy to do. It's a one-liner. You can do it at home. You don't have to walk into a synagogue if that's too scary for you. So I think that's why lighting candles is often the first thing. When I work with conversion students, depending on when I start with them, what time of the year, the first thing I teach them is not always Shabbos candles. It's usually within the first month that I do teach the Shabbos candles, but oftentimes it depends on what time of the year. So if if they join me right before high holidays, then I focus first on synagogue mitzvot, and I focus on prayer because that's so much part of the high holiday experience. But I also then talk about the home rituals, and one of those home rituals being candle lighting. There's one conversion student who just became Jewish about a month ago, two months ago at this point. He started studying with me right before Hanukkah. So the first thing I taught him was Hanukkah candles. So it's not always Shabbat candles at first, but it is, I wouldn't say easy, but it's a very common one-liner, low barrier to entry, nice thing to do.
Right, because I know like with the bar mitzvahs, that's one thing that, the sisterhood gives,
They give
Shabbos-
candlesticks.
yeah.
Yeah, but they also give Kiddush cups, right? Okay, so you might say, do you teach lighting Shabbos candles first to the girls and then to the boys? Should you teach them Kiddush? Or maybe there's other things. And if you think about it, like Risa is a bar mitzvah tutor. The first thing she teaches the kids is not Kiddush or candle lighting, right? She's starting with something else, not because it's more important, but because the focus of the bar mitzvah studies is very much about reading from the Torah, chanting Haftorah, perhaps leading some of the prayers. So all of these things are important. It's hard to, whenever I get asked a question, I do get asked a lot about what's important or what's the first. It's very hard to answer those questions because there isn't always the most important. Some would say the first thing to teach a conversion student is the Shema, believe in God, monotheism, then we'll talk about the rest. And I don't start with that, but there are rabbis who do. Okay, I want to end with something which may be less familiar to you.
I have a quick question.
Yes,
Which
Joanne, I hear Joanne's voice. Let me get Joanne's face. There we go. Okay.
Joanne has a face.
Yeah.
I think you alluded to it, but Ira said distinctly that women should light the Hanukkah, the Friday night candles, Shabbos candles. I never thought of it exclusively as a woman's role. A person, if you're a male living alone or you're a male in the household, whatever.
Yeah, so I think where Ira may be coming from, and I don't want to speak for Ira, but the traditional gender distinctions within Judaism, and when I say traditional, it could be talking about Orthodox, but also outside of the Orthodox world, even like in Israel, there's the word for conservative Judaism is Masorti. So yes, the Masorti movement is egalitarian, but the tradition of lighting candles was very much the domain of women. Didn't mean men couldn't do it. And as community conservative and reform and reconstructionist and renewal communities came up around the world and became egalitarian, lighting candles became something that was more gender neutral. I know when I used to have, and I hope I still can this year, have the Hebrew high school kids over for a Shabbat dinner, and we light candles. I ask everybody to light candles if they feel comfortable. And most of the boys, with I think one exception over the years, has felt comfortable lighting the Shabbat candles. But for some, that is like a woman's thing.
Well, in reverse, putting on tefillin, only the men did. Now women can do it as well.
Right. But you see, like even in our shul, which is egalitarian, women can wear tefillin, but how many do? Like even at the worldwide wrap, there aren't that many women who feel comfortable putting on tefillin or who choose to put on tefillin. Does that make us less egalitarian? Perhaps, but when you think about traditional gender role distinctions, there are some, and that would be a good example to fill in.
Or a talit, let's say, bring it to a talit, women never wore them, now they do.
Right, more and more. So the last categorization scheme I wanted to share with you, and then we'll have to go because of time, and I'll go into the next things in our next class. There is a book called The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism. Some of you studied parts of that book with me in a previous class. We did a wow session on the Temple Beth Am without walls. I think one of the classes was in the Stein's house, as I recall. And remember those days before the pandemic when we had classes in people's houses and we sat close together, where the goal was to be closer together, not further apart? Why? Well, the question 2 of that book, the 9 questions people ask about Judaism, it is, why do we need organized religion or Jewish laws? Isn't it enough to be a good person? And I think that's a nice piggyback question to what Alice raised before when we were talking about images of God. In answer to that question, Prager and Telushkin come up with these 4 categories of Jewish law, and they use it as a way of taking the mitzvot that we have, any of the 613 Torah ones or any of the rabbinic ones, and putting it into these categories. But they also take certain mitzvot like kashrut and Shabbat and show how these mitzvot fit into all the categories. And it's definitely a way to think of, expanding our understanding of what mitzvah is. When we talk about doing mitzvot, the Chabad approach with the candle lighting is mitzvot are, I'll go back to our other categories here, a mitzvah, the mitzvah they start you with is a do. It's a mitzvah ben adam lamakom. It's something you do at home, and it's the individual, okay? Another way to think of mitzvot is this mitzvah an ethical one? Is it a holiness one? Is it historical, or is it national? And I'm going to define them for you, and that's how I'm going to end today's class. Reflexive laws are those that elevate the performer of the law. So every act we perform affects us, and we often lose sight of this, but there are certain Jewish laws whose purpose is almost exclusively to affect the performer. And the most obvious example of this is prayer. The primary purpose of prayer is to affect the person who's praying, not to affect something in the outside world. When we're asking God for things, it's lehit palel. Lehit palel is the form of verb called lehit pa'el. It's causative. It's not causative. It's reflexive. It literally means to judge oneself, to examine oneself. When we're asking for things or praising God for certain things, it's really more a matter of setting out a bunch of Jewish values and saying that I, as an individual, aspire to them. So that would be, you know what? I didn't even put that in here. Sorry. I put these 4 here, and I'm talking about reflexive, and I didn't type it in there. Reflexive. That's what it is. It's reflexive.
What's reflexive?
Yeah, that's what I was describing. I'm in a misprint right there. Okay, reflexive is like prayer. It's something that God doesn't need our prayers, we need it. Reflexive is something that affects the performer. Another example of a reflexive mitzvah would be tzitzit. And the reflexive purpose of the mitzvah of tzitzit is so that we will see, so that we will remember to do the mitzvot. That's in that 3rd paragraph of the Shema that we didn't look at today, but that's the part where we kiss our tzitzit. Ethical mitzvot, this overlaps to some extent with this category, the mitzvot ben adam l'chaveiro, the ethical interpersonal. So that's more, I guess, readily apparent. Ethical mitzvah would be everything from giving tzedakah to honoring your parents to social action, all of that good stuff. Treating animals well, caring for the weak, the ill, the poor, comforting mourners, like all of these are ethical mitzvot according to this system of mitzvot. Holiness, this is how Prager and Telushkin define Mitzvot of Holiness. They say the purpose of the laws of holiness is to elevate our actions to a level of holiness, to make our actions and even our time and our space as holy. So it could be designating holy time like Shabbat, designating holy spaces such as synagogues, mitzvot that are associated with the synagogue, putting a mezuzah on your door. That would be a way of elevating the mundane doorpost to a higher level. Saying blessings before and after we eat. That would be considered a mitzvah of holiness. And then finally, the category of historical national, these are mitzvot that have some kind of either historical story that goes with them. So like many of the Passover mitzvot, many of the holidays that have a story behind them, whether we're talking about Purim or Hanukkah, but there's a story and we're commemorating a historical event in Jewish history, that it would be one of those type of mitzvot. And national, similar as well. Although I do want to read some very interesting thing here. It says here, well, since Passover is coming up, it says something Among the best known of Judaism's national laws is the eating of matzah during Passover. When the Jews were liberated from their slavery in Egypt, they did not have sufficient time to bake bread and instead ate unleavened bread, matzah. 3,200 years later, we still refrain from bread during the holiday that commemorates the Jews' exodus from Egypt. Likewise, Jews eat bitter herbs at the Passover Seder so as to identify with the Jews who suffered enslavement in Egypt. The Passover Seder itself is largely a national mitzvah, which helps to explain why it is the most widely observed Jewish ritual among secular Jews, as well as religious Jews. So I will leave you with those thoughts. Let's see if you have any thoughts you want to leave me or yourselves with, and we will say Lehitraot after that. Any comments, Elaine?
This is really not pertinent in a way, but I just want to tell everybody, I used to get my Ahava stuff from Janet Schwartz or Naomi Blum when they went to Israel, but you can get it now on Amazon.
And the Freehold Mall. Okay, anybody else with something either apropos or not apropos to Jewish spirituality? Go ahead, Marilyn. Marilyn, I think you're frozen.
She's frozen. Yeah.
Okay, anybody else while Marilyn unfreezes?
Just a question, when it says national, does it mean national like here in America, or we talk about national Israel?
National, neither. National, more like ethnic. I guess that would be probably a better word. Judaism is a religion and a nationality. So the nationality part of Judaism, as opposed to the solely religious part of Judaism. So if you look in Israel, secular Jews, there are certain holidays and rituals they do, and certain they don't. And the ones they're more apt to do are ones that view Judaism as a nationality. Okay. Any last comments? Okay, thank you, everybody. And I will leave on the screen for you to think about today, maybe as a goal.